Every morning, at exactly 6:30, before the rest of Ashton Ridge had fully awakened, Thomas Walker opened the front door of his small white farmhouse. The old wooden porch creaked beneath his boots. The maple tree beside the steps swayed gently in the morning breeze. Birds sang from the fence posts. The world felt peaceful, almost untouched. Thomas carried a small metal tray. On it, 2 steaming cups of coffee. Always 2. Never one. He placed the first mug on the little round table beside his rocking chair. The second, he carefully set on the chair across from him. The steam rose quietly into the cool autumn air. Then, he sat down, folded his hands, and watched the sunrise. He never spoke. He never reached for the second cup. He simply waited for nearly 30 minutes. Every single morning, people in town noticed. Of course they did. Small towns noticed everything, especially routines, especially lonely ones. Across the street, Mrs. Henderson watered her flowers. Every morning she looked toward Thomas's porch, then quietly sighed. Poor man, he still sets out coffee for Alina. Her husband gently shook his head. Grief doesn't keep calendars. Others believed the same thing. The mail carrier, the grocery clerk, children riding bicycles to school. Everyone assumed the second cup belonged to the wife Thomas had buried 7 years earlier. No one ever asked. Some questions people considered too painful. The truth was something else entirely. After Alina passed away, Thomas had indeed spent weeks sitting alone. 1 chair, 1 cup, 1 empty house. Silence followed him everywhere, until one rainy afternoon. He remembered something Alina had once said. Years earlier, a young firefighter had come to their home after losing his father. He hadn't wanted advice. He hadn't wanted answers. He had only needed somewhere to sit. Alina had quietly poured him a cup of coffee, then sat beside him for an hour. They barely spoke. When he finally stood to leave, the young man smiled. "I feel lighter." Thomas had asked later, "What did you say to him?" Alina laughed softly. "Almost nothing." She squeezed his hand. "People don't always need wisdom. Sometimes, they only need to know someone is willing to stay." After Alina died, those words never left him. One morning, Thomas brewed 2 cups instead of 1. He carried them both outside, not because he expected Alina to return, but because he wanted there to be a place ready for anyone who needed company. Days passed, then weeks, months, years. No one ever sat down. Still, every morning, Thomas carried out 2 cups. The waitress at Miller's diner once asked him, "Why waste good coffee?" Thomas smiled. "It's never wasted." She looked confused. "No one's drinking it." Thomas simply answered, "Not yet. 7 years. More than 2,000 mornings. More than 2,000 fresh cups. Always replaced before they grew cold. Always waiting." Some people quietly admired him. Others thought he had become eccentric. Children invented stories. Teenagers laughed as they rode past. Old Mr. Carter once joked, "That chair's the most patient thing in town." Thomas laughed. "I hope it stays that way." On the first Monday of October, the leaves turned brilliant shades of red and gold. A chilly wind swept through Ashton Ridge. School buses rumbled down the narrow streets. Thomas carried his usual tray outside. 2 mugs, fresh coffee, 2 chairs, the same quiet routine. He settled into his rocker, wrapped both hands around his own cup, closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the wind, listening to the birds, listening to life continuing. Several blocks away, 12-year-old Noah Brooks walked slowly toward school. His backpack hung from one shoulder. His eyes stayed fixed on the sidewalk. 3 months earlier, his father had been killed by a drunk driver. Since then, the world no longer made sense. Friends didn't know what to say. Teachers tried too hard to be kind. His mother cried when she thought he wasn't looking. So Noah stopped talking. To everyone, that morning, he couldn't make himself walk into school. Instead, he kept walking, without any destination. Just away, the quiet streets led him through neighborhoods he had never visited before. Then, he noticed something unusual. An old man, 2 steaming cups of coffee, 1 empty chair. Waiting, Noah slowed his steps. He looked at the chair, then at the old man. Thomas looked up. Their eyes met for only a moment. Neither smiled. Neither looked away. Thomas gently lifted the second mug, not offering it, not insisting, simply acknowledging. The chair was there, if it was needed. For the first time in 7 years, someone stopped walking. Noah stood silently at the edge of the porch, looking at the empty chair, looking at the warm cup of coffee, wondering why an old man would prepare for someone who never came. Thomas spoke only 5 quiet words. "You're welcome to sit." Noah didn't answer, but he didn't leave either. The autumn wind carried the smell of fresh coffee across the porch, and for reasons neither of them could yet explain, the empty chair would not remain empty much longer. The old wooden porch remained silent. The autumn breeze gently stirred the steam rising from the untouched cup. Thomas didn't speak again. He had learned long ago. Silence often invited honesty better than questions ever could. Noah stood at the bottom of the steps. His backpack hung loosely from one shoulder. His eyes never left the empty chair. For several long moments, neither of them moved. Finally, the boy climbed the 3 wooden steps. Slowly, carefully, as if stepping into a place where loud voices weren't allowed. Thomas simply nodded, then looked back toward the sunrise, giving Noah the freedom to arrive without feeling watched. Noah sat down. The chair creaked softly beneath him. For 7 years, it had waited. Now, it finally carried someone. Thomas gently slid the warm mug across the little table. "It's hot. You don't have to drink it. I just thought your hands might be cold." Noah wrapped both hands around the cup. The warmth surprised him. He hadn't realized how cold he felt. Not just outside. Inside, too. Several minutes passed. The only sounds were birds, and the occasional car driving toward town. Thomas sipped his coffee, never once looked directly at the boy. He remembered Alina's way. "Don't rush. Don't rescue. Simply remain." Finally, Noah whispered, "Why do you always make 2?" Thomas smiled faintly. "I was wondering when someone would ask." Noah looked toward the empty street. "Everyone says, 'It's for your wife.'" Thomas shook his head gently. "No, I loved my wife very much, but she doesn't need coffee anymore." The answer caught Noah off guard. "Then, who is it for?" Thomas looked toward the maple tree. Its golden leaves drifted slowly to the ground. "It's for whoever needs it." Noah frowned. "You don't even know who's coming." Thomas chuckled softly. "Neither does loneliness." The boy stared quietly into his cup. That answer stayed with him. Several more minutes passed. Then Thomas spoke again. You skipped school today. Noah's shoulders tensed. I. Thomas raised one hand gently. You don't owe me an explanation. The tension disappeared almost immediately. No accusations. No lecture. No disappointed sigh. Just acceptance. Noah whispered. Everyone keeps asking if I'm okay. Thomas nodded. I imagine they do. The boy swallowed hard. His fingers tightened around the mug. But his voice cracked. And nobody waits for the real answer. Thomas slowly closed his eyes. Not because he didn't know what to say. Because he knew. This wasn't the moment for words. Instead, he quietly reached into the pocket of his old jacket, pulled out a folded handkerchief, placed it on the table between them, then returned to drinking his coffee. Nothing more. Noah looked at the handkerchief. Then, without embarrassment, he used it. Tears came before he could stop them. The first tears he'd allowed himself to cry. In front of another person. Since his father's funeral. I'm tired, he whispered. So tired. Thomas nodded. I believe you. Noah looked surprised. That's it. Thomas smiled kindly. What else needs saying? The boy thought for a moment. Then, for the first time, he began talking. Not all at once. Just little pieces. My dad. He always made pancakes on Saturdays. A pause. Mom pretends she's okay. But I hear her crying. Another pause. My friends stopped asking me to play baseball. They think I want to be alone. Another silence. I don't. Thomas listened. Completely. Without interrupting. Without finishing sentences. Without trying to fix grief. When Noah finally stopped speaking. Nearly 20 minutes had passed. His coffee had grown cold. The pain hadn't disappeared. But somehow, it no longer felt as heavy. Thomas stood, picked up both empty mugs, then smiled. You know, Elena used to tell me something. Noah looked up. What? Thomas quietly washed the cups at the porch sink, then answered, broken hearts don't heal, because someone gives the perfect advice. He dried one mug carefully. They heal, because someone stays long enough. For the hurting person to remember. They're not carrying the weight alone. Noah looked down at the porch floor. I don't think anyone's ever stayed. Thomas looked at him. I'm still here. The words were simple. They carried no promise. No grand speech. Just truth. And somehow, that truth meant more than anything Noah had heard in months. The old church bell rang 8 o'clock. School had already begun. Noah stood slowly. I should probably go. Thomas nodded. I think your teachers will still be there. A tiny smile appeared on Noah's face. The first one, since his father died. As he reached the porch steps, he stopped, turned around. Can I? He hesitated. Come back tomorrow. Thomas looked at the empty chair, then at the second coffee mug resting upside down beside the sink. He smiled. I was planning on making 2 cups. The next morning, at exactly 6:30, Thomas carried his tray onto the porch. 2 steaming cups. Just as always. Only this time, he found someone already waiting at the bottom of the steps. A 12-year-old boy, holding 2 fresh cinnamon rolls he'd bought with his own allowance. Noah smiled shyly. I figured coffee shouldn't be lonely either. For the first time in 7 years. Both cups grew cold, because 2 people had been too busy talking to remember to drink them. The next morning, Noah arrived 10 minutes early. The sky was still painted with shades of blue and orange. The town hadn't fully awakened. Even the birds seemed reluctant to break the peaceful silence. Thomas was already outside. 2 cups of coffee rested on the little round table. Beside them, 2 warm cinnamon rolls. Thomas smiled. "I thought we'd trade breakfast today." Noah laughed softly. "I was thinking the same thing." For nearly half an hour, they talked about ordinary things. School, baseball, fishing, old movies. Nothing about grief. Nothing about funerals. Nothing about loss. And somehow, that was exactly what Noah needed. To remember, life still contained ordinary mornings. As Noah prepared to leave, Mrs. Henderson walked slowly across the street, carrying a basket of freshly picked apples. She had watched the 2 of them talking for nearly a week. Curiosity had finally overcome hesitation. She smiled politely. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Thomas stood. "You never could." She looked toward Noah. "You seem happier." The boy nodded. "I think I forgot. People can actually listen." Mrs. Henderson quietly smiled. "So did most of us." After Noah left for school, Mrs. Henderson remained standing beside the porch. She looked at the second chair, then back at Thomas. "I've been wondering." Thomas nodded gently. "I know." She hesitated. "My husband passed away last winter." Thomas quietly lowered his eyes. "I heard." Mrs. Henderson forced a small smile. "Everyone keeps bringing casseroles." Thomas chuckled softly. "They mean well." "They do." She sighed. But after the food stopped coming, so did everyone else. The porch grew quiet again. Thomas slowly reached for the coffee pot sitting beside him. Without asking, he poured another cup, then placed it on the empty chair. Mrs. Henderson looked surprised. "I wasn't asking." "I know." Thomas smiled. "But the chair doesn't mind." She slowly sat down, carefully wrapping both hands around the warm mug. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Finally, Mrs. Henderson whispered, "I still set 2 dinner plates." Thomas nodded. "I understand." She looked embarrassed. "I know it's silly." Thomas gently shook his head. "No, it's love. Looking for somewhere to sit." Those simple words broke something open inside her. Tears quietly rolled down her cheeks. "I still talk to him," she admitted. "When I burn the toast, I blame him." Thomas smiled. "I still blame Alina. When I lose my glasses." Mrs. Henderson laughed through her tears. "So you do it too?" "Every chance I get." The laughter surprised both of them. Grief had become lighter, not because it disappeared, because someone else understood it. The following morning, something unexpected happened. Noah arrived. Mrs. Henderson arrived. Thomas quietly placed 3 cups of coffee on the table. Nobody mentioned it. Nobody questioned it. The extra chair simply appeared, as though it had always belonged there. A few days later, the town mail carrier stopped by. "I've got 5 minutes before my next route." Thomas pointed toward an empty chair. "The coffee's hot." The following week, a retired Army veteran named Frank wandered onto the porch. He hadn't spoken much since returning home years earlier. Thomas poured another cup. No questions. No introductions. Just coffee. Frank sat silently for nearly 20 minutes. Then finally whispered, "I still hear the helicopters." Thomas nodded. "I imagine they're loud." Frank stared into his cup. "They are." Thomas didn't ask anything else. He didn't need to. One by one, people began finding the porch, not because Thomas had answers, but because he never acted uncomfortable around pain. Word quietly spread across Ashton Ridge. If your heart felt heavy, there was an old man on Maple Street who always made one extra cup. The waitress from Miller's diner noticed it first. Then the barber. Then the pastor. Soon, people stopped calling it Thomas's porch. Instead, they simply said, "Meet me at the second cup." Everyone understood. One chilly Friday morning, Noah counted the mugs on the table. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He smiled. "I thought you only made 2. Thomas laughed softly. "I used to." Noah looked around. Mrs. Henderson was chatting quietly with Frank. The mail carrier was sharing homemade muffins. 2 strangers were introducing themselves for the first time. No one seemed rushed. No one checked a watch. For a little while, everyone simply belonged. Noah looked toward Thomas. "Did you plan all this?" Thomas slowly shook his head. "No, I only left one chair empty." He watched the morning sunlight spill across the porch. The rest, he smiled warmly, was people deciding they didn't want anyone to sit alone anymore. That afternoon, the pastor visited Thomas. He looked out across the porch, then quietly asked, "Do you realize what's happening here?" Thomas smiled. "I think people are drinking too much coffee." The pastor laughed. "No, I think they're finally telling each other the truth." As the sun rose over Ashton Ridge the next morning, there was no longer just one empty chair. There were 6, and for the first time in many years, Thomas found himself hoping they wouldn't stay empty for very long. By the middle of October, Thomas's porch no longer belonged to just one man. Every morning, someone different found their way there. Some stayed 10 minutes. Others stayed an hour. No appointments. No invitations. Just coffee and a chair waiting for whoever needed it. The townspeople slowly developed an unspoken rule. Whoever arrived first poured coffee for the next person. Thomas noticed it one morning. Before he could lift the coffee pot, Mrs. Henderson had already filled Frank's mug. Frank quietly poured one for Noah. Noah placed a fresh cinnamon roll onto Thomas's plate. No one had discussed it. Kindness had simply become contagious. Thomas smiled. Elena would have liked this. Mrs. Henderson looked toward the empty rocking chair beside him. "I think she already does." The mornings became warmer. Not because of the coffee, because of the people. Neighbors who had lived on the same street for 20 years finally learned each other's stories. One morning, Frank admitted he still woke up from nightmares. The following day, the pastor quietly handed him a notebook. "I couldn't sleep after my wife died either." Writing helped. Frank accepted it without a word. Sometimes, understanding didn't require advice, only recognition. Another morning, the mail carrier confessed he planned to retire. "I don't know who I'll be without this route." Mrs. Henderson smiled gently. "You'll still be Harold. You'll just have more time to drink coffee with us." Everyone laughed, even Harold. As autumn deepened, more chairs appeared. Thomas never remembered buying them. Someone simply left one on the porch. A week later, another appeared, then another. By the end of the month, 8 chairs surrounded the little table. No one questioned it. The porch was growing, the same way families do, one person at a time. Then, on a cold Thursday morning, a young woman stood quietly at the bottom of the steps. She couldn't have been older than 30. A baby slept peacefully against her shoulder. Dark circles surrounded her tired eyes. She looked as though she hadn't rested in weeks. Thomas smiled warmly. "Good mornings." She hesitated. "I heard." She looked around nervously. "People come here when they don't know where else to go." Thomas nodded. "That happens sometimes." Mrs. Henderson quietly stood. Without saying a word, she carried an extra chair over. Frank gently took the baby's diaper bag. Noah smiled. "I'll keep an eye on your stroller." The young mother blinked. No one had even asked her name. Yet somehow, they had already made room for her. "My name is Emily," she whispered. "And this," she kissed the baby's forehead, "is Lily." Thomas poured another cup. Emily wrapped both hands around it. The warmth seemed to steady her. For several minutes, she simply watched the steam rise. Finally, she spoke. "My husband lost his job 3 months ago." No one interrupted. "He found work in another state. He left last week." Again, only silence. "He said he'd send for us." Her voice trembled. "But I don't think he will." The porch remained completely still. Emily looked down at the sleeping baby. "I'm not angry. I'm just..." She struggled to find the words. "So tired of pretending I'm strong." Mrs. Henderson slowly reached across the table. She rested her hand gently over Emily's. "You don't have to pretend here." Emily closed her eyes. A single tear slipped down her cheek. Then another. Then many more. No one rushed to comfort her. No one offered easy answers. They simply stayed. Exactly as Thomas had stayed for Noah. Exactly as Alina had once stayed for a grieving firefighter. After several quiet minutes, Lily began to fuss. Before Emily could stand, Frank smiled awkwardly. "I raised 3 daughters." He gently bounced the baby in his arms. Within seconds, Lily fell asleep again. Everyone laughed softly. Even Frank looked surprised. "I guess I haven't forgotten everything." Emily watched the strangers around her. A retired firefighter. A widow. A veteran. A 12-year-old boy. A mail carrier. People she had never met before. Acting like family, she whispered, "I didn't know places like this still existed." Thomas smiled. "They only exist after enough people decide to become one." The next morning, Emily returned. This time, she carried a basket of homemade blueberry muffins. "I didn't know how to say thank you." Thomas took one. "You just did." Within a few weeks, the porch had become something unexpected. Young and old sat together. Teenagers listened to veterans. Widows laughed with children. Retirees encouraged young parents. No one cared about age, occupation, politics, or how much money anyone had. For 1 hour each morning, everyone was simply a neighbor. One Saturday, Noah counted the chairs. "There are 10 now." Thomas chuckled. "I may have to build a bigger porch." The group laughed, but the idea lingered. A bigger porch for a town that was slowly learning. No one should carry life's burdens alone. As everyone prepared to leave, the pastor looked around at the gathering, then quietly said, "I've been thinking." Everyone turned toward him. What if this wasn't only Thomas's porch anymore? What if we shared it with the whole town? Thomas looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" The pastor smiled. "I think this little tradition deserves a name." The group fell silent, each person considering the same thought. Perhaps What had begun with 2 simple cups of coffee was about to become something much larger than any of them had imagined. The idea spread through Ashton Ridge faster than anyone expected. No newspaper announced it. No posters hung in shop windows. No one created a social media page. People simply told one another, "If your heart feels heavy, come to Thomas's porch. There will always be coffee and someone willing to listen." The first Saturday in November, Thomas walked onto the porch carrying a much larger tray. Instead of 2 cups, there were 12. Mrs. Henderson laughed. "I think you're officially running a cafe." Thomas smiled. "I hope not. Cafes charge people." She looked around at the gathering. This place gives something away. The porch was already full. Frank sat polishing an old pocket knife. Emily gently rocked baby Lily to sleep. Noah finished his homework before school. Harold, now retired from the mail route, brought fresh apple cider instead of coffee. Even the pastor had arrived early. The chairs were no longer empty. Yet, everyone still left one chair open. Just in case. Above the porch door, Noah had painted a small wooden sign. The letters weren't perfectly straight, but no one wanted to change them. It simply read, "The second cup morning. Everyone is welcome." Thomas stared at the sign for a long moment, then quietly smiled. "I wish Alina could see this." Mrs. Henderson answered softly, "I have a feeling she already has." As the morning continued, neighbors came and went. Some stayed 5 minutes. Others stayed much longer. There were stories, laughter, a few tears, and long stretches of comfortable silence. No one tried to fix anyone. They simply made room for them. Just after 8 o'clock, an unfamiliar pickup truck pulled slowly to the curb. No one recognized it. The driver remained inside for several moments, watching the porch, watching the people, watching Thomas. Finally, the driver's door opened. A man stepped out, perhaps 60 years old. Tall, broad shoulders, a weathered brown jacket. His face carried the tired look of someone who had spent years working with his hands. But it wasn't age that stood out. It was regret. He walked toward the porch, then stopped halfway, as though suddenly unsure he belonged there. Thomas looked up. Their eyes met. Something felt strangely familiar. The stranger removed his cap. "Morning." Thomas nodded politely. "Good morning." The man glanced toward the empty chair. "I heard. This seat's for anyone." Thomas smiled. "It always has been." The man slowly sat down. He wrapped both hands around the warm mug Thomas quietly placed before him. For nearly 10 minutes, he said absolutely nothing. No one hurried him. Everyone else simply continued their conversations, giving him the privacy of not being watched. Finally, he spoke. "My name's Daniel." Thomas nodded. "I'm Thomas." Daniel smiled faintly. "I know." Thomas looked puzzled. "Have we met?" Daniel stared into his coffee. "Once. A very long time ago." Thomas searched his memory. The face stirred something distant. Smoke. Rained. Sirens. A cold winter night. But he couldn't quite place it. Daniel quietly reached into his wallet. He removed an old newspaper clipping. The paper had yellowed with age. Its edges were worn from being unfolded countless times. He handed it to Thomas. The headline read, "Local firefighter rescues family from house fire." The photograph beneath it showed a much younger Thomas, covered in soot, carrying a little boy wrapped in a blanket. Thomas looked carefully at the picture, then at Daniel. His eyes widened. You? Daniel nodded. I was that little boy. The porch fell completely silent. Even Noah stopped writing. Frank slowly lowered his coffee cup. Mrs. Henderson covered her mouth. Thomas whispered, I remember. Daniel smiled sadly. You probably remember the fire. I remember. The man who carried me outside. For a long moment, neither spoke. 40 years disappeared, leaving only two people, whose lives had crossed for a single night. Daniel looked toward the maple tree. My parents didn't survive. Thomas quietly lowered his eyes. I know. Daniel continued softly. I grew up with my aunt. I moved away. I built a life. I got married. I raised two daughters. Thomas smiled. I'm glad. Daniel nodded. So am I. Then his smile slowly faded. My wife passed away last year. Silence returned. I suddenly realized I'd spent my whole life thanking everyone, except the man who gave me that life. Thomas felt his throat tighten. You don't owe me anything. Daniel gently shook his head. Maybe not, but gratitude has a way of waiting, until we're finally brave enough to deliver it. He reached into the pocket of his jacket. Carefully, he placed an old photograph on the table. It showed a frightened little boy, wrapped in a firefighter's coat, standing beside a young Thomas. On the back, written in a child's uneven handwriting, were 8 simple words. Thank you for giving me tomorrow. Thomas stared at the photograph. He had never seen it before. Daniel smiled. I wrote that when I was 8. My aunt told me, one day you'll meet him again. I never stopped carrying it. Thomas's eyes filled with tears. For years, he had believed retirement meant his life's work was finished. Now, he understood something different. Kindness never retired. Its echoes simply traveled farther than we could ever imagine. Before leaving, Daniel stood beside the porch steps. He looked back at everyone gathered there, then quietly said, I came here to thank one man. He smiled, but I think I've found a whole family. No one answered. They didn't need to. Mrs. Henderson simply poured him one more cup of coffee. And this time, Daniel stayed until every cup on the table had grown cold. Winter arrived quietly in Ashton Ridge. The maple tree beside Thomas's porch had long since surrendered its golden leaves. Snow covered the rooftops. The mornings grew colder. Yet, at exactly 6:30, the porch lights still came on. The coffee still brewed, and the chairs still waited. By December, the second cup morning had become part of the town's rhythm. The bakery donated fresh bread every Friday. The grocery store quietly left fruit on the porch each Monday. The high school woodworking class built 6 more chairs. No one asked who deserved them. Everyone simply believed there should always be enough room for one more person. Thomas often looked around the porch and smiled. 7 years ago, he had prayed someone might someday sit in the second chair. Now, most mornings, he worried there wouldn't be enough chairs. Noah was changing too. At 13, he laughed more easily. His grades had improved. He had returned to baseball. One morning, he admitted something to Thomas. You know, I still miss Dad every day. Thomas nodded. I imagine you always will. Noah smiled softly. But now, missing him doesn't stop me from living. Thomas's eyes glistened. Grief hadn't disappeared. It had simply learned to walk beside hope. Just a week before Christmas, a heavy snowstorm swept across the county. Most people stayed indoors. The roads were nearly empty. Thomas wasn't sure anyone would come. Still, he brewed 12 cups of coffee. Old habits had become promises. At 7 o'clock, only one chair was occupied. Mrs. Henderson sat quietly knitting a tiny blue scarf. "I don't think many people will make it today." Thomas smiled. "Then we'll drink the extra coffee tomorrow." As the wind howled across the street, a small figure appeared through the falling snow. At first, Thomas thought it was a child walking to school. But school had been canceled. The figure kept walking. Slowly, head lowered, a worn backpack hung over one shoulder. No winter gloves, no hat, just a thin jacket against the freezing wind. Mrs. Henderson frowned. That child shouldn't be outside. Thomas was already standing. The girl reached the porch. She couldn't have been older than 16. Snowflakes clung to her dark hair. Her lips trembled from the cold. She looked exhausted, as though she hadn't slept in days. Thomas opened the door. "Come inside." She hesitated. "I don't want to bother anyone." Thomas smiled gently. "That's never been a rule here." Without another word, Mrs. Henderson wrapped the blue scarf around the girl's shoulders. It was supposed to be a Christmas gift. She smiled. "I think Christmas came early." The girl blinked rapidly. No one had shown her kindness in a long time. Thomas handed her a steaming mug. "Careful. It's hot." She wrapped both frozen hands around it. Slowly, color began returning to her face. "My name's Thomas." The girl looked into her cup. After a long silence, she whispered, "I'm Ovid." No one asked another question. They simply sat together, watching snow fall beyond the porch, listening to the wind, waiting. Nearly 15 minutes passed before Ava spoke again. "I've been on 3 buses." Mrs. Henderson quietly looked up. "I left home yesterday." Thomas didn't react. He simply listened. "My mom remarried." Ava continued. "My stepfather." She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. No one asked her to. Some stories didn't need details to be understood. "I packed my backpack. I thought I'd figure something out." She laughed bitterly. "I was wrong." Tears rolled down her cheeks. "I've never felt so alone." Thomas leaned forward slightly. His voice remained calm. "You aren't alone today." Ava looked around the porch. An elderly widow, a retired firefighter, a teenage boy, fresh coffee, warm bread, a blue scarf someone had just given away. It didn't make sense. These people didn't know her. Yet somehow, they cared. Noah quietly reached into his backpack. He pulled out a folded sandwich wrapped in paper. "My lunch." He placed it gently beside Ava. "I'm not that hungry." Thomas smiled to himself. He knew better. Noah was always hungry. Frank removed his heavy wool gloves. "They'll fit better than mine." He handed them to Ava. Emily, who had arrived moments earlier with little Lily bundled in blankets, quietly searched through the diaper bag. She found a pair of brand new knitted socks. "I bought the wrong size." She smiled. "Maybe they were always meant for you." Ava could no longer hold back her tears. She buried her face in her hands. "I don't understand." Thomas looked toward the snow-covered street. Alina used to say, "The world becomes warmer, one small kindness at a time." The pastor arrived just then, covered in snow. He took one look at Ava, then quietly sat beside her. "I know a family," he said gently. "They've been approved as emergency foster parents. They've been waiting for the right moment to help someone. Ava looked frightened. I don't want charity. Thomas smiled kindly. No, you deserve safety. There's a difference. Within the hour, the pastor made a phone call. The county youth counselor arrived. Not with flashing lights, not with questions shouted across the porch, but with a warm blanket and gentle conversation. Exactly the way healing begins. Before leaving, Ava stood at the bottom of the steps. She looked back at Thomas, then at everyone gathered on the porch. I thought I had nowhere left to go. Thomas smiled. You didn't. You just hadn't found this porch yet. As the car disappeared into the falling snow, Noah quietly asked, Do you think she'll be okay? Thomas looked toward the empty chair, the one that had waited 7 long years. Then he smiled. I think she found her first safe morning. And sometimes, that's where a whole new life begins. That Christmas Eve, a handwritten card appeared in Thomas's mailbox. There was no return address. Inside, only one sentence was written. Thank you for giving me a place to stop before I gave up. Beneath the words, a single signature. Ava. Thomas folded the card carefully, placed it beside Alina's old photograph, then quietly whispered, Merry Christmas. Spring arrived gently in Ashton Ridge. The snow melted. The maple tree outside Thomas's porch slowly filled with bright green leaves once again. The mornings became warmer. The coffee tasted just as comforting. And every chair was almost always occupied. Nearly 4 months had passed since Ava first walked through the snow carrying nothing but a backpack. No one knew much about where she had gone. Thomas never asked. He believed something Alina had always said. If someone leaves in hope, trust them enough to return in peace. One bright Saturday morning, Noah was arranging fresh flowers on the porch railing. Mrs. Henderson carried a basket of blueberry muffins. Frank was teaching little Lily, now happily toddling around the porch, how to toss birdseed without frightening the sparrows. The laughter felt natural now, almost as though it had always lived there. A familiar car slowly pulled up beside the sidewalk. The driver stepped out first, a kind-looking woman in her 40s. Beside her, Ava. She looked different, healthier, confident. The sadness that had once filled her eyes had softened into quiet hope. Before anyone could speak, Ava hurried up the steps. She walked straight toward Thomas, then wrapped her arms around him. Thank you, she whispered, for believing I deserved another chance. Thomas smiled warmly. I only offered coffee. Ava laughed. No, you offered something much harder to find. She looked around the porch. You offered safety. The woman beside her stepped forward. My name is Karen. My husband and I became Ava's foster parents. She smiled proudly. And next month, if everything goes well, we'll officially become her family. Mrs. Henderson quietly wiped away a tear. Emily hugged Ava tightly. Frank cleared his throat. I'm getting too old for crying this much. Everyone laughed, especially Frank. Ava reached into her backpack. She removed a folded report card. Carefully, she handed it to Thomas. Across the top, every subject showed an A. Thomas looked up. You worked hard. Ava smiled. I remembered something you told me. Thomas frowned gently. I tell people a lot of things. She laughed. You said, one safe morning can become the first page of a new life. Thomas smiled. I suppose I did. Noah leaned over to look at the report card. Well, you beat my math grade. Ava grinned. Barely, as everyone shared breakfast together. A white van stopped across the street. Then another, and another. People climbed out carrying cameras. Not television crews. Not reporters chasing headlines. Just ordinary people. Some held notebooks. Others carried thermoses of coffee. All of them looked toward the porch. The pastor walked over. They are from neighboring towns. Thomas looked surprised. Why? The pastor smiled. They heard about the second cup morning. They want to see if it's real. Thomas looked around the porch. It doesn't look like much. Mrs. Henderson laughed. That's because you're looking at the chairs. She gently placed a hand over her heart. We're looking at what happens in them. Soon, the visitors joined the circle. There was no speech. No formal introduction. Thomas simply poured more coffee. And another chair was added. Then another. One visitor introduced himself. My wife died 18 months ago. I haven't eaten breakfast with another person since. Thomas quietly slid a mug toward him. Then today's a good day to start. A woman from another county smiled nervously. Our town has 3 empty churches, but nowhere people can simply talk. Emily answered softly. You don't need a church. You just need someone willing to stay. Before noon, people had begun writing ideas in small notebooks. Community coffee mornings, neighborhood breakfasts, park benches where strangers were welcome to sit, free conversation tables at libraries. One elderly man quietly whispered, I think loneliness has been waiting for someone to organize kindness. Thomas listened quietly, then slowly shook his head. No, he smiled gently. Kindness doesn't need organizing. It just needs someone willing to begin. Several weeks later, something remarkable happened. Photographs began arriving in Thomas's mailbox. A porch in Ohio, a small cafe in Montana, a library in Oregon, a community center in Tennessee. Each picture showed something simple. 2 chairs, 2 cups, a handwritten sign. The second cup morning. Thomas spread the photographs across his kitchen table. Alina's picture stood beside them. He smiled toward her. Look what happened. We only needed 1 empty chair. That Sunday, Noah counted the photographs. There are 12. Emily corrected him. No, she smiled. There are 12 we know about. As the morning came to an end, Ava stood beside the porch steps. She looked toward the sign Noah had painted months earlier, then quietly added a second wooden plaque beneath it. It read, No one leaves here carrying their burden alone. Everyone stood silently, reading the words. Frank nodded. That's exactly what this place became. Thomas looked around at the people gathered before him. Some had once arrived broken. Some had once arrived lonely. Some had once believed no one cared. Now, they laughed together like old friends. Like neighbors. Like family. He realized something Alina had understood long before he ever did. Love doesn't always arrive with grand gestures. Sometimes, it arrives quietly, in the form of a warm cup of coffee, an empty chair, and someone who chooses to stay. Spring slowly gave way to summer. The mornings in Ashton Ridge arrived earlier now. Sunlight spilled across Thomas's porch before the coffee had finished brewing. The maple tree was full again. Its branches stretched wide, casting gentle shade over the growing circle of chairs. Thomas celebrated his 80th birthday that June. He hadn't planned anything special. In fact, he hoped no one would remember. He had never enjoyed being the center of attention. I've had enough birthdays. He joked to Noah. I'd rather just drink my coffee. Noah smiled. I don't think that's going to happen. Thomas looked suspicious. What are you hiding? Nothing, Noah answered far too quickly. Thomas laughed. That means everyone's hiding something. For nearly 2 weeks, the people of Ashton Ridge whispered whenever Thomas wasn't nearby. Mrs. Henderson disappeared every afternoon. Frank borrowed tools from the hardware store. Emily spent evenings painting wooden boards. Even little Lily, now 3 years old, kept telling Thomas, "We're making a surprise," before Emily quickly changed the subject. Thomas pretended not to notice, but deep inside, he couldn't remember the last time so many people had smiled around him. On the first Saturday of June, Thomas carried his usual tray onto the porch. 12 cups of coffee, 1 extra chair, the same peaceful routine. Only, no one was there. He looked across the street. Empty. The bakery hadn't delivered bread. Mrs. Henderson's curtains remained closed. Even Noah was missing. Thomas smiled to himself. I suppose everyone overslept. Just as he lifted his coffee cup, he heard music. Soft at first, then louder. A small marching band from the local high school slowly turned the corner. Behind them came dozens of familiar faces. Children, parents, teachers, firefighters, police officers, veterans, nurses, shop owners, families, nearly the entire town. Thomas stood speechless. What on earth? Noah walked at the front of the crowd, holding a wooden sign. He grinned. Happy birthday, Grandpa Thomas. The crowd applauded. Not loudly, not wildly, just warmly, like family. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward. You've spent years making room for everyone else. She smiled through tears. Today, we made room for you. The crowd slowly moved aside. Across the street, Thomas noticed something new. An empty piece of land beside the community park had been completely transformed. A wide wooden deck, a roof for shade, long picnic tables, flower gardens, dozens of rocking chairs, more than 50 wooden chairs arranged in welcoming circles. At the entrance, a beautiful carved arch stood proudly. Across it, golden letters read, "The Second Cup Community Porch. No one sits alone here." Thomas quietly removed his glasses. He blinked several times, unable to believe what he was seeing. The mayor stepped forward. "We all wanted to thank you." Thomas gently shook his head. "I didn't build this." The mayor smiled. "No, you built something much harder. You reminded us how to notice each other again." The mayor continued. "This porch belongs to everyone. It will always have free coffee. It will always have empty chairs. And it will always welcome anyone who needs a place to breathe." Frank laughed. "We even made the coffee stronger." The crowd burst into laughter. Thomas wiped away another tear. "I hope that's not permanent." Emily walked toward Thomas, carrying a small wooden box. Inside were dozens of handwritten notes. "What's this?" Thomas asked. Emily smiled. "Letters from everyone whose life changed because of 1 extra cup." Thomas slowly unfolded the first note. It was from Noah. "You didn't replace my dad. You helped me remember that losing someone doesn't mean losing everyone. Thank you for staying." Thomas quietly folded it again. His hands trembled. The next letter belonged to Mrs. Henderson. "I thought grief meant eating dinner alone forever. Now I have breakfast with friends every week. Thank you for leaving 1 chair empty." Another letter. "Frank, for years I believed courage belonged on the battlefield. You taught me that sometimes courage is simply telling another person you're not okay." Emily's letter. My daughter will grow up believing strangers can become family. That is one of the greatest gifts anyone has ever given us. Thomas couldn't continue reading. His vision blurred with tears. Then, little Lily walked onto the stage. She carried something almost as large as she was. A bright yellow ceramic coffee mug. The words painted across it made everyone smile. Reserved for the next stranger. Lily proudly handed it to Thomas. So you'll never stop making one extra cup. Thomas knelt carefully. His voice barely rose above a whisper. I promise. As everyone applauded, a bus quietly pulled into the parking lot. It wasn't from Ashton Ridge. Then another arrived. And another. Visitors stepped off carrying familiar wooden signs. Ohio, Kentucky, Colorado, Montana, Tennessee, Oregon, small towns from across the country. Each had started their own second cup morning. One elderly woman approached Thomas. She hugged him tightly. You don't know me. Thomas smiled. I don't have to. She nodded. Our town hasn't lost a single senior to complete isolation this year. She gently squeezed his hand. People finally started checking on each other. Thomas stood silently. One empty chair had traveled farther than he ever imagined. As evening settled over Ashton Ridge, the new community porch filled with music. Children played. Neighbors laughed. Coffee continued pouring. No one looked at a clock. No one hurried home. For just a little while, the whole town remembered something life often makes people forget. Being together is one of the greatest comforts we can give each other. Before leaving, Thomas looked toward Noah. You know, I thought I was building a habit. Noah smiled. What were you really building? Thomas looked across the porch where strangers and old friends sat side by side. He answered softly, a place where loneliness finally ran out of empty chairs. In years past, the maple tree beside the old farmhouse had grown taller. Its branches stretched wide across the porch. Every spring, its leaves returned. Every autumn, they gently drifted onto the wooden floor where countless conversations had begun. Some things changed. Some things remained exactly the same. Thomas Walker was now 90 years old. His steps had become slower. His hands trembled slightly whenever he carried the coffee tray. So, Noah carried it with him. Every morning, just as naturally as breathing. Noah wasn't a little boy anymore. He had become a high school counselor. Every day, he listened to teenagers who believed no one understood them. Whenever they thanked him, he always smiled and quietly answered. I learned from someone who knew how to listen. Emily had become director of the town's community outreach program. Frank volunteered every Thursday at the Veterans Center. Mrs. Henderson baked muffins every Saturday morning. Ava had graduated from college. She was now a social worker. Helping teenagers who felt they had nowhere safe to go, every one of them had carried a piece of Thomas's porch into the world. One quiet evening, Thomas sat watching the sunset. The porch was empty for the first time that day. Noah joined him. Neither spoke for a while. Finally, Thomas smiled. You know,